The morning sun cast long shadows across forward operating base Crimson when Staff Sergeant Kira Ghost Volkov first heard the words that would define the next 72 hours of her life. The comment came from behind her as she cleaned her Barrett M82A1, the .50 caliber rifle gleaming under the harsh Afghan light like a promise waiting to be kept. "Women ain't got the patience for precision work," growled Master Sergeant Dale Hutchins, his weathered face creased with the kind of certainty that comes from 23 years of military service. "Takes a special kind of steady to make the shots that matter." Kira didn't turn around. She'd heard variations of this speech before, in different forward bases, from different men who confused volume with authority. Her fingers continued their methodical work, sliding the bolt carrier group back into place with the kind of practiced silence that had earned her call sign 3 deployments ago. The other snipers in the armory, all men, chuckled at Hutchins' pronouncement, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls like spent brass hitting the ground. What they didn't know, what none of them could have predicted, was that in less than 6 hours, Kira would be lying prone on a ridge 1,500 yards from Hutchins' position, watching through her loophole scope as insurgent forces closed in on his isolated patrol. They didn't know that her steady hands, the ones Hutchins questioned, would be the only thing standing between his team and a coordinated ambush that intelligence had somehow missed entirely. The irony wasn't lost on Kira. She'd grown up in the mountains of Montana, where her grandfather had taught her to hunt elk at distances that would make most military marksmen nervous. "Breathe like the wind," he used to say in his accented English, remnants of the Russian he'd carried from the old country. "Let the shot find its own way home." Those lessons, learned on frozen peaks where a missed shot meant going hungry, had served her well through 3 combat tour and more confirmed kills than anyone at FOB Crimson suspected. But reputation is a funny thing in the military. It travels through official channels and unofficial whispers, through after-action reports and late-night conversations over lukewarm coffee. Kira's reputation had somehow gotten lost in translation, filtered through the assumptions of men who saw her slight frame and quiet demeanor as weakness, rather than the coiled precision of a mountain predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As she reassembled her rifle, Kira caught fragments of Hutchins' continued monologue about women in combat roles, each word sharp enough to cut, but not quite sharp enough to penetrate the armor of indifference she'd built over years of proving herself in a world that questioned her presence at every turn. The afternoon briefing would change everything. Intelligence had identified increased insurgent activity in the Korangal Valley, and Hutchins' team would be walking into what promised to be the most dangerous patrol of their deployment. Kira would volunteer for Overwatch, as she always did, positioning herself where she could do the most good while remaining invisible to both enemy and friendly forces. In the armory's harsh fluorescent light, surrounded by the smell of gun oil and the echo of masculine certainty, Kira Volkov smiled a smile that would have chilled the blood of anyone smart enough to recognize it. She had work to do. The CH-47, Chinook's twin rotors beat against the thin mountain air like mechanical thunder as it lifted off from FOB Crimson, carrying Hutchins' 12-man patrol toward what intelligence officers were calling a routine reconnaissance mission. From her position in the bird's web seating, Kira watched the landscape below transform from the relative safety of the base perimeter to the wild, unforgiving terrain of the Korangal Valley, a place Marines had nicknamed the Valley of Death for reasons that needed no explanation. Hutchins sat across from her, his M4 carbine held with the casual familiarity of a man who'd carried weapons longer than some of his team had been alive. His eyes held that particular brand of skepticism reserved for people who'd volunteered for jobs they hadn't been invited to take. When Kira had stepped forward during the mission briefing, offering to provide overwatch from the northern ridge, Hutchins had looked at her like she'd suggested tap dancing through a minefield. "You sure about this, Volkov?" he'd asked, his voice carrying just enough doubt to make it clear he wasn't really asking, Gonna be a long day in the dirt, lot of waiting, lot of watching. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette. Women couldn't handle the mental discipline required for precision shooting, couldn't maintain the focus necessary to track targets across vast distances while remaining motionless for hours at a time. Kira had simply nodded, her response as economical as everything else about her approach to soldiering. Now, 30 minutes into the flight, she could feel Hutchins' eyes on her as she performed her pre-mission ritual. From her pack, she withdrew a photograph creased and faded from years of handling, showing a young girl standing next to an old man in hunting camouflage. Her grandfather, Dmitry Volkov, had taken her hunting for the first time when she was 8 years old. In the photo, she's holding a .22 rifle almost as tall as she is, her face serious with the weight of responsibility he'd taught her came with every trigger pull. Every shot is a promise, Dmitri had told her that first day, his words carrying the weight of old-world wisdom. Promise to the animal that you will make it clean. Promise to yourself that you will make it count. Promise to those who depend on you that you will not fail when they need you most. The Chinook began its descent toward the valley floor, the pilot's voice crackling through the intercom with coordinates and weather updates. Outside, the mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks lost in clouds that promised rain before nightfall. Kira folded the photograph and tucked it into her breast pocket, right over her heart, where it had rested during every mission for the past 4 years. She could feel the familiar pre-mission calm settling over her, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times before, a combination of focused intensity and absolute stillness that made her body feel both weightless and immovable. Her breathing slowed, her pulse steadied, and the noise of the helicopter faded into background static. Hutchins was still watching her, probably wondering what thoughts occupied the mind of a woman about to spend the next 8 hours alone on a mountain with nothing but a rifle and the kind of patience he didn't believe she possessed. If he'd known what she was really thinking, calculating wind speeds, memorizing terrain features, and running through a dozen different scenarios for protecting his team, he might have reconsidered his assessment of women in combat roles. The helicopter's landing gear touched down with a metallic thump that signaled the beginning of what would become a legend whispered through military bases for years to come. The insertion went smooth as silk, the kind of textbook operation that makes young lieutenants think warfare is predictable and old sergeants nervous about what's coming next. Hutchins' team moved through the valley with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated through years of training and multiple deployments together. They were good soldiers. Kira had to admit, disciplined, alert, and professional in the way that keeps men alive in places where mistakes get measured in body bags. She separated from the group at the predetermined point, a rocky outcropping that would serve as her staging area for the climb to Overwatch position. The last thing she heard from Hutchins before radio silence was his voice over the comm, professional but tinged with something that might have been concern. Crimson 7, be advised Ghost is moving to Overwatch. Time on station approximately 800 hours. The response came back crisp and efficient. Copy, Crimson 6. Ghost is green for Overwatch. Weather update shows possible precipitation beginning 1400 hours. Kira acknowledged with a double click on her radio and began the ascent, her movement through the rocky terrain as fluid and silent as water flowing downhill. She'd studied the satellite imagery for hours, memorizing every boulder, every depression, every potential firing position along the ridge line. The Barrett on her back weighed 28 pounds, but she carried it like it was an extension of her own body. Her muscles adapted to the weapon's weight through thousands of hours of training and real-world application. The climb took 47 minutes, each step calculated to minimize noise and avoid skylining herself against the ridge. When she reached her chosen position, a natural depression between 2 boulders that provided concealment and a clear field of fire across the valley, she began the methodical process of preparing for what could be a very long day. First came the range card, a detailed sketch of the terrain below with distances marked to prominent features. The village of Kamdesh sat in a bowl at 1,247 yards. The river crossing where Hutchins' team would establish their observation post measured exactly 1,156 yards from her position. The switchback trail that provided the most likely avenue of approach for any hostile forces stretched across her field of view at ranges varying from 900 to 1,600 yards. She set up the Barrett with the kind of reverence a pianist shows for a Steinway, adjusting the bipod legs until the rifle sat perfectly level. The crosshairs of her Leupold Mark IV scope bisecting the horizon with mathematical precision. The weapon's massive bulk seemed almost delicate under her hands, every adjustment measured in fractions of degrees that could mean the difference between a clean hit and a catastrophic miss at the distances she might be called upon to shoot. From her pack, she withdrew her spotting scope and set it on a small tripod to her left, giving her the ability to observe the battlefield independently of her rifle scope. Through the spotting scope's 20-power magnification, she could see Hutchins' team moving through the valley like ants crossing a kitchen floor, their progress steady but vulnerable in the way that all ground movement becomes when viewed from above. The radio crackled softly in her earpiece. Ghost, Crimson 6, we're approaching Checkpoint Alpha. How's the view from up there? Kira keyed her radio twice. Message received and understood. From her elevated position, she could see what Hutchins couldn't. 3 separate groups of military-age males moving through terrain features that would put them in position to observe or intercept his patrol. The first group consisted of 4 individuals moving along a ridgeline approximately 800 yards southeast of Hutchins' position. They moved with the kind of tactical spacing that suggested military training, and at least 2 of them carried what appeared to be AK-47 variants. The second group, 3 men with a possible RPG, had taken position in a cluster of buildings that would give them commanding fields of fire across the valley floor. The third group worried her most. 5 individuals moving through a series of wadis that would allow them to approach Hutchins' team from the rear without being detected. Through her spotting scope, Kira watched the tactical situation develop with the same detached fascination with which she might observe a chess match between grandmasters. Each move by Hutchins' patrol was being countered by corresponding movements from the insurgent groups, as if someone was coordinating their actions from a position where the entire battlefield was visible. Someone like her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. There was another observer out there, someone with elevation and communications capability, someone who was orchestrating what looked increasingly like a coordinated ambush. Her eyes swept the opposite ridge line, searching for the telltale glint of optics or the unnatural geometry of a concealed position. She found him at 1,847 yards, nearly a mile away, positioned behind a low stone wall that provided excellent concealment and a commanding view of the entire valley. Through her scope, she could see the distinctive outline of a Soviet-era Dragunov sniper rifle and the figure of a man who moved with the same professional efficiency she recognized in herself. The pieces of the tactical puzzle fell into place with terrifying clarity. This wasn't a chance encounter or a patrol stumbling into the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. This was a carefully orchestrated ambush, with Hutchins' team walking into a kill zone that had been prepared specifically for them. The enemy sniper on the far ridge wasn't just observing, he was coordinating, directing the movement of the ground teams through hand signals and radio communications that Kira couldn't intercept. She had perhaps 10 minutes before Hutchins' patrol reached the point of no return, the place in the valley where escape would become impossible and survival would depend entirely on the accuracy of a woman, whose capabilities had been dismissed by the very man she was now sworn to protect. Kira's hands moved across her equipment with the same precision her grandfather had shown when preparing for a hunt that would feed the family through a Montana winter. She adjusted her scope's elevation turret, compensating for the extreme range and the mountain air's thin density. She calculated wind speed and direction, factoring in the thermal currents that would carry her bullet across nearly a mile of hostile territory. And then she settled into the kind of perfect stillness that separates true snipers from ordinary marksmen, her breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the mountain itself, her finger resting lightly on the Barrett's trigger as she waited for the moment when everything she'd learned, everything she'd practiced, everything she'd endured would be tested in a single shot that would determine whether 12 American soldiers came home alive. The radio in her earpiece crackled with Hutchins' voice, casual and confident. "Ghost, Crimson 6, all quiet down here. Looks like Intel was wrong about increased activity in this sector." If only he knew. Time moved differently at altitude, especially when viewed through a rifle scope at maximum magnification. Kira had learned this during her first deployment, how minutes could stretch into hours when you were responsible for other people's lives, how the weight of decision could make seconds feel like eternities. Now, watching Hutchins' patrol approach the kill zone, she felt that familiar distortion of temporal reality, as if the universe had slowed down to give her time to make the calculations that would determine who lived and who died in the next few minutes. Through her spotting scope, she tracked the enemy sniper's movements on the far ridge. He was good, very good. His position was nearly perfect, offering concealment from ground observation while providing clear fields of fire across multiple sectors. But he'd made one mistake, the kind of error that separated competent shooters from true masters of the craft. He'd positioned himself where the morning sun would eventually backlight his scope lens, creating the telltale glint that had allowed Kira to locate him in the first place. Her range finder put him at 1,847 yards, well beyond the effective range for most sniper systems, but still within the Barrett's envelope of lethality. The shot would require perfect execution, precise range estimation, accurate wind reading, and flawless trigger control. At that distance, a miscalculation of even a few inches would send the massive .50 caliber projectile wide of its target, potentially alerting the entire enemy force to her presence while leaving them free to execute their ambush. Kira began her pre-shot routine, the same sequence of actions she performed hundreds of times in training and dozens of times in combat. She checked her scope's zero, verified her range card calculations, and studied the wind indicators scattered across the valley dust devils, vegetation movement, and the behavior of birds in flight. The mountain air was relatively still, but she could detect subtle thermal currents rising from the valley floor that would affect her bullet's trajectory during its 3-second flight time. The radio crackled again. "Ghost, Crimson 6, we're approaching the river crossing now. Everything looks good from down here." Kira keyed her radio once acknowledged but unable to respond. She couldn't break her own operational security by transmitting, not when she was about to take a shot that would reveal her position to every enemy fighter in the valley. Instead, she watched through her scope as Hutchins' team began crossing the shallow river, their movements predictable and exposed in the way that made her chest tight with anticipation. The enemy ground teams were moving into position with choreographed precision. The 4-man team on the southeast ridge had taken firing positions overlooking the river crossing. The 3-man team with the RPG had moved to windows in the building complex that would give them direct shots at Hutchins' patrol. Most dangerously, the 5-man team moving through the wadis had positioned themselves to cut off any retreat route, effectively boxing in the American patrol on 3 sides. Through her rifle scope, Kira could see the enemy sniper making final adjustments to his position, his movements economical and professional. He was preparing to take his shot, probably targeting Hutchins or the patrol's radio operator, the kind of leadership decapitation shot that would sow confusion and make the subsequent ground assault devastatingly effective. She had to make her decision now. Take the shot and save Hutchins' team, or maintain her concealment and watch 12 American soldiers walk into a coordinated ambush that they had no chance of surviving. Her finger found the Barrett's trigger, and she began the breathing cycle that would synchronize her shot with her body's natural rhythm. Inhale slowly, exhale halfway, hold, and in the natural respiratory pause that followed, apply steady pressure to the trigger until the massive rifle fired with a sound like thunder in the thin mountain air. The bullet flew true across nearly a mile of hostile territory, guided by physics and years of training toward a target who would never see it coming. The Barrett's recoil drove back against Kira's shoulder like a mule kick, but she rode it expertly, keeping the scope picture stable enough to observe the shot's impact. At 1,847 yards, the .50 caliber projectile struck the enemy sniper center mass, the massive bullet's kinetic energy lifting him from his firing position and dropping him behind the stone wall in a way that left no doubt about the shot's effectiveness. But Kira's satisfaction at eliminating the primary threat lasted only seconds. The sound of the Barrett's shot echoed across the valley like rolling thunder, announcing her presence to every insurgent fighter within miles. She watched through her spotting scope as the carefully orchestrated ambush devolved into chaos, the enemy ground teams suddenly unsure of their target priorities as they tried to locate the source of the devastating fire that had just eliminated their coordinator. Contact, contact, sniper fire from unknown location. Hutchins' voice exploded across the radio net, his professional calm cracking under the sudden realization that they were walking into a prepared ambush. All elements, take cover and report. Kira was already shifting her scope to the four-man team on the southeast ridge, the group that posed the most immediate threat to Hutchins' exposed patrol. Through her Leupold's magnification, she could see them frantically scanning the opposite ridge line, searching for the shooter who had just eliminated their Overwatch element. They were well-disciplined fighters. She had to admit, instead of panicking, they were moving to flank Hutchins' position while maintaining their own security. The lead fighter carried an AK-47 with what appeared to be a GP-25 grenade launcher attached, a weapon combination that could devastate the American patrol if he managed to find the range. Kira settled her crosshairs on his center mass, compensated for the 1,156-yard distance, and squeezed the trigger with the same mechanical precision she'd used on the first shot. The second .50 caliber round found its target with surgical accuracy, dropping the grenadier and sending his three companions scrambling for better cover. But their movement revealed their positions to Hutchins' team, who responded with the kind of coordinated fire and movement tactics that had been drilled into them through countless training exercises. Ghost, Crimson 6. Hutchins' voice came through the radio with new urgency. We need immediate fires on the building complex. Grid 41 RPR 12,340, 5, 67,890. Multiple enemy personnel with possible RPG. Kira was already shifting her scope toward the building complex, her mind automatically calculating the range and windage adjustments needed for the 1,034-yard shot. Through the scope, she could see movement in the window's fighters positioning themselves for shots that would turn Hutchins' patrol into casualty statistics. The third shot came as naturally as breathing, the Barrett's massive projectile punching through the mud brick wall and into the fighter who had been lining up an RPG shot on the exposed American patrol. The building erupted in dust and debris, the remaining insurgents inside thrown into confusion by the devastating precision fire that seemed to come from nowhere. But Kira knew her time was running out. Each shot revealed more about her position, and she could see enemy fighters beginning to converge on her ridge line. The five-man team that had been moving through the wadis was now climbing toward her location, their movements determined and coordinated in a way that suggested they understood exactly what kind of threat they were facing. She had maybe 5 minutes before they reached her position, 5 minutes to eliminate as many targets as possible before being forced to abandon her Overwatch position and begin the fighting withdrawal that would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise. Through her radio earpiece, she could hear Hutchins coordinating his team's movement toward better defensive positions, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. Crimson 7, Crimson 8, bound by teams toward the tree line. Ghost, wherever you are, keep up that covering fire. Kira allowed herself a grim smile as she acquired her fourth target, one of the fighters from the original four-man team, who was attempting to flank Hutchins' position from the north. The shot was routine by her standards, a mere 987 yards against a moving target who had made the fatal mistake of exposing himself while trying to achieve a better firing angle. The Barrett spoke again, its thunder rolling across the valley like the voice of an angry god. The tactical situation was deteriorating with the kind of mathematical precision that makes experienced soldiers nervous and young lieutenants reach for their radios to call for help. Kira could see the enemy reaction force climbing toward her position, 5 men moving with the kind of tactical discipline that suggested former military training, possibly Afghan National Army soldiers who had switched sides when the political winds changed direction. They were good, she had to admit. Instead of charging straight up the ridge like amateur fighters might have done, they were using proper bounding overwatch techniques, with 2 men providing security while 3 advanced, then switching roles to maintain continuous coverage of their approach route. In 15 minutes, maybe 20 if she was lucky, they would reach her position with enough firepower to make her continued presence on the ridge a very short-term proposition. But 15 minutes was an eternity in a firefight, and Kira intended to make the most of every second. Through her spotting scope, she could see that Hutchins' patrol had reached the relative safety of a tree line that would provide concealment from most of the remaining insurgent positions. The immediate crisis had passed, but the enemy still had enough fighters scattered around the valley to make extraction problematic. Her radio crackled with a new voice, the battalion operations center back at FOB Crimson. Ghost, this is Crimson Base. We're tracking multiple enemy personnel in your sector. What's your assessment? For the first time since the engagement began, Kira broke radio silence. Crimson Base, Ghost. Enemy sniper eliminated. Grid 41 RPR 15,678, 98,765. Multiple insurgent teams still active. Crimson 6's element requires immediate extraction support. Ghost, Crimson Base. Roger your transmission. Be advised, dust-off is 15 minutes out. Can you maintain overwatch until extraction? Kira glanced at the approaching enemy team, now less than 300 yards from her position and moving with increased urgency. Crimson Base, Ghost. Negative on sustained overwatch. I'm about to have visitors. The understated military terminology conveyed everything that needed to be said. The operations center would understand that she was about to be engaged at close range, that her ability to provide precision fires for Hutchins' team was about to end, and that the next phase of the battle would be fought with carbines and grenades rather than long-range precision fire. She began breaking down her position with the same methodical approach she'd used to establish it. The Barrett went into its carrying case, the spotting scope collapsed into its protective housing, and her range cards disappeared into the map pocket of her uniform. In 90 seconds, she had transformed from a fixed sniper position into a mobile infantry soldier ready for close-quarters battle. The sound of voices speaking Pashto drifted up from the rocks below. The enemy team was closer than she'd estimated, perhaps 5 minutes from her position. Kira slung the Barrett case across her back, drew her M4 carbine, and began moving along the ridge line toward a secondary position she'd identified during her initial reconnaissance. The withdrawal route led through a series of rocky outcroppings that would provide concealment from ground observation while allowing her to maintain visual contact with the enemy team's approach. As she moved, she could hear Hutchins' voice over the radio, coordinating with the incoming helicopter extraction. Dust off 2-6, Crimson 6. LZ is cold at this time, but be advised we have enemy personnel throughout the valley. Crimson 6, dust off 2-6. Roger, we're inbound your location, ETA 7 minutes. 7 minutes. Kira had to keep the enemy team occupied for 7 minutes, long enough for Hutchins' patrol to reach the landing zone and board the extraction helicopter. 7 minutes that would determine whether 12 American soldiers went home to their families or became another casualty statistic in a war that most people back home had stopped following in the news. She reached her fighting position just as the first enemy fighter appeared on the ridge line behind her, his AK-47 sweeping back and forth as he searched for targets. At 150 yards, he was well within the effective range of her M4, but taking the shot would reveal her new position and bring the entire enemy team down on her location. Instead, she waited, letting him pass within 100 yards of her concealed position before engaging with the kind of precision that would end the fight quickly and decisively. The M4's first shot dropped the lead insurgent fighter with clinical efficiency, the 5.56 round striking center mass, and producing the kind of immediate incapacitation that military ammunition is designed to achieve. His 4 companions reacted with trained reflexes, dropping to covered positions and returning fire toward the muzzle flash that had revealed Kira's location. The rocky outcropping that provided her concealment erupted in sparks and stone chips as AK-47 rounds impacted all around her position. The insurgents were firing with disciplined accuracy, their shots grouped tightly enough to keep her pinned down while they maneuvered for better firing angles. These weren't amateur fighters or weekend warriors. They understood small unit tactics and knew how to apply suppressive fire effectively. Kira low-crawled to a new firing position, her movement masked by the sound of incoming rounds ricocheting off the rocks around her original location. From her new angle, she could see 2 of the remaining fighters attempting to flank her position from the left, their movement coordinated through hand signals that spoke of professional military training. Her second shot took the closer flanker in the upper torso, spinning him around and dropping him behind a boulder that would provide concealment but no protection from the M4's penetrating power. She shifted quickly to the second flanker, who had frozen in place when his partner went down, apparently unsure whether to continue the advance or seek better cover. His hesitation cost him his life. The M4's third round found its target at 97 yards, the shot placement precise enough to ensure immediate incapacitation. 2 down, 2 remaining, and both of the survivors were now seeking cover behind positions that limited their ability to maneuver effectively. The tactical mathematics were working in her favor, but time was still her enemy. Each passing minute brought the extraction helicopter closer to the landing zone, but it also increased the likelihood that additional insurgent forces would arrive to reinforce the team currently engaging her. In this part of Afghanistan, enemy fighters could appear with surprising speed, emerging from villages and hideouts that dotted the valley like a spider web of potential threats. Her radio crackled with Hutchins' voice. "Ghost Crimson 6, dust off is 2 minutes out. What's your status?" Crimson 6 Ghost. Engaged with enemy team on ridgeline. Will break contact when dust off is wheels up. The professional understated language conveyed everything that needed to be communicated. She would hold her position and keep the enemy team occupied until Hutchins' patrol was safely aboard the extraction helicopter, then begin her own fighting withdrawal toward the secondary extraction point that had been briefed as part of the mission planning. One of the remaining insurgent fighters made the mistake of exposing himself while trying to get a better angle on her position. The M4's fourth shot was as inevitable as sunrise, the carefully aimed round ending the fighter's war with the same clinical precision that characterized everything about Kira's approach to soldiering. That left one enemy fighter still active, and from his firing position, she could hear him speaking rapidly into a radio, calling for reinforcements, probably, or coordinating with other insurgent teams that might still be active in the valley. Either way, her time in this position was running out quickly. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see the U-60 Black Hawk approaching the valley floor, its rotors beating against the thin mountain air as it descended toward the landing zone where Hutchins' team waited. The helicopter's door gunners were scanning the surrounding terrain, their M240 machine guns ready to provide suppressive fire if the landing zone came under attack. Kira made her decision. Time to end this engagement and begin moving toward her own extraction point. The sound of rotor blades echoed off the valley walls like mechanical thunder as the U-60 Black Hawk settled into the landing zone, its crew chiefs scanning the surrounding terrain with the kind of hypervigilance that keeps aircrews alive in hostile territory. Through her spotting scope, Kira watched Hutchins' team bound toward the helicopter in pairs, their movement disciplined despite the urgency of extraction under potential enemy observation. She had perhaps 90 seconds before the Black Hawk lifted off, 90 seconds to suppress the remaining insurgent fighter and begin her own movement toward the secondary extraction point located 3 kilometers north of her current position. The distance might as well have been 300 kilometers given the terrain she'd have to cross while carrying the Barrett and avoiding whatever additional enemy forces were undoubtedly converging on the sound of gunfire. The last insurgent fighter chose that moment to make his move, rising from behind his rocky cover with an RPG-7 launcher that he aimed not at Kira's position, but at the helicopter settling onto the landing zone below. The geometry of the shot was perfect. He had clear line of sight to the aircraft and was positioned at an angle that would make return fire from the door gunners difficult. Kira's M4 cracked twice in rapid succession, both rounds finding their target before the RPG could be fired. The fighter collapsed backward, the rocket-propelled grenade launcher falling from lifeless hands to clatter against the rocks. The threat to the extraction helicopter had been eliminated, but the sound of her shots would draw attention from every enemy fighter within miles. "Dustoff 26, you're clear for departure," she heard Hutchins transmit over the radio. "All personnel aboard." "Roger, Crimson 6, Dustoff 26 departing the area." The Black Hawk rose from the valley floor like a mechanical angel, its rotors clawing for altitude as it banked toward the safety of friendly airspace. Kira watched through her scope until the aircraft disappeared over the ridgeline, carrying Hutchins and his team toward the hot showers and warm meals that represented civilization in this part of the world. Now came the hard part. She had to move 3 kilometers across hostile territory to reach her own extraction point, carrying 28 pounds of sniper rifle plus her combat load of ammunition, water, and survival gear. The route would take her through terrain that offered limited concealment and multiple opportunities for ambush by enemy forces who now knew approximately where she was located. Her radio crackled with the battalion operations center. "Ghost, Crimson Base. Be advised, we're tracking multiple enemy personnel moving toward your last known position. Recommend immediate displacement to Extraction Point Bravo." "Crimson Base, Ghost. Roger, moving to Extraction Point Bravo. ETA 30 minutes. 30 minutes to cover 3 kilometers of mountain terrain while carrying a full combat load and avoiding enemy contact. It was doable, but it would require every bit of fieldcraft and physical conditioning she developed over 4 deployments and countless training exercises. The Barrett's weight would slow her down, but abandoning the rifle wasn't an option. The weapon contained too much sensitive technology to leave for enemy forces to examine and potentially reverse engineer. She began moving along the ridge line, using the rocky terrain to mask her movement from observation by enemy forces in the valley below. Her route took advantage of every piece of concealment. The mountain offered draws and defiles that would hide her silhouette, rock formations that would break up her outline, and vegetation that would provide visual screening from enemy spotters. Behind her, she could hear voices shouting in Pashto as additional insurgent fighters reached the engagement area. They would find the bodies of their comrades and begin tracking her movement, following boot prints and other sign that even the most careful soldier leaves when moving across terrain. Her head start was maybe 10 minutes, 15 if she was lucky. The weight of the Barrett case bit into her shoulders as she picked up the pace, moving as quickly as she could while maintaining noise discipline and visual security. 3 kilometers had never seemed so far. The extraction point lay in a shallow depression between 2 ridge lines, a natural landing zone that had been selected during mission planning for its defensibility and concealment from ground observation. As Kira approached the coordinates, she could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Her ride home was inbound, right on schedule. She reached the extraction point with 6 minutes to spare, immediately establishing a perimeter defense and conducting a communications check with the inbound aircraft. The U-60 Black Hawk appeared over the northern ridgeline precisely on time, its crew scanning the landing zone for any sign of enemy activity before committing to the approach. Ghost Dustoff 32, landing zone appears clear, ready for pickup. Dustoff 32 Ghost, LZ is secure, ready for extraction. The helicopter settled into the landing zone with practiced precision, its crew chief gesturing for Kira to approach from the rear. She ran across the open ground with the Barrett case bouncing against her back, every step bringing her closer to safety and the debrief that would follow this mission. As the Black Hawk lifted off and banked toward Fob Crimson, Kira allowed herself a moment to process what had just occurred. She had eliminated an enemy sniper at nearly 1,900 yards, broken up a coordinated ambush, and successfully extracted after engaging enemy forces at close range. But the mission's significance went beyond tactical success. It represented something more profound about capability, assumption, and the price of underestimating people based on preconceptions. The helicopter's vibration lulled her into the kind of post-combat calm that experienced soldiers recognize, the physiological come-down that follows intense action, when adrenaline fades and the mind begins processing events that happened too quickly for conscious analysis during the engagement itself. Through the aircraft's window, she watched the Korangal Valley recede below, its peaks and valleys holding secrets that would never make it into official reports. 23 minutes later, the Black Hawk touched down at Fob Crimson's helicopter landing zone, and Kira found herself walking across the same tarmac where this morning's conversation about women and precision shooting had taken place. The irony wasn't lost on her as she carried the Barrett case toward the armory, the weapon that had just saved 12 lives slung across her shoulder with the same casual familiarity she'd shown while cleaning it hours earlier. The debriefing took place in the Tactical Operations Center, a windowless concrete room filled with computers, radio equipment, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everything look like a crime scene photograph. Major Patricia Reynolds, the battalion intelligence officer, sat across from Kira with a digital recorder and a stack of forms that would transform today's events into the sanitized language of military bureaucracy. "Walk me through the engagement sequence," Major Reynolds said, her voice carrying the professional neutrality that intelligence officers learn to maintain when collecting after-action information. "Start with your observation of enemy forces and continue through extraction." Kira began her account with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, describing the tactical situation in terms of ranges, coordinates, and timing that could be verified through radio logs and satellite imagery. She spoke of wind speeds and bullet drop, of target identification and rules of engagement, of the mathematical certainties that governed precision shooting at extreme distances. But between the lines of her official report lay a different story, one about a woman whose capabilities had been questioned that morning by the very man whose life she'd saved that afternoon. It was a story about assumptions and prejudices, about the difference between reputation and reality, and about the moment when professional competence transcends the limitations that others try to impose. Major Reynolds listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification on technical details that would be important for the official record. When Kira finished her account, the intelligence officer sat back in her chair and studied the woman across from her with undisguised professional admiration. "Sergeant Volkov," she said finally, "that was some of the finest precision shooting I've heard about in 4 deployments. The battalion commander is going to want to debrief you personally." Word of the engagement spread through Fob Crimson with the speed that military gossip achieves when the story involves dramatic action and clear-cut heroism. By evening chow, every soldier on the base knew about the female sniper who had eliminated an enemy spotter at nearly 1,900 yards and broken up a coordinated ambush that would have decimated an entire patrol. The story grew in the telling, as military stories always do, acquiring embellishments and dramatic details that made good conversation over lukewarm coffee and prepackaged meals. But at its core remained the undeniable facts. Kira Volkov had demonstrated shooting skills that few snipers could match, tactical awareness that had prevented a massacre, and professional competence that rendered irrelevant every assumption about gender and combat effectiveness. Hutchins found her in the armory that evening, cleaning the Barrett with the same methodical attention she'd shown that morning. His approach was different now, less swagger, more substance, the kind of careful respect that combat veterans show for people who have proven themselves under fire. "Volkov," he said, his voice carrying none of the dismissive certainty that had characterized their morning interaction. "I owe you an apology, and probably my life." Kira looked up from her rifle, meeting his eyes with the same steady gaze that had served her so well through a rifle scope. "No apology necessary, Sergeant. Just doing my job." "Your job?" Hutchins shook his head, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Lady, what you did today goes way beyond anybody's job description. That was some of the finest shooting I've ever heard of, and I've been in this business for over 20 years. The conversation that followed would become part of Fob Crimson's folklore, repeated in mess halls and briefing rooms long after both soldiers had rotated back to the United States. It was a conversation about capability and respect, about the difference between assumptions and reality, and about the moment when professional recognition transcends personal prejudice. But for Kira, sitting in the armory with gun oil on her hands and the satisfaction of a mission well executed settling into her bones, the conversation represented something simpler and more profound. Validation of everything her grandfather had taught her about patience, precision, and the promises that come with every trigger pull. Outside, the Afghan night settled over Fob Crimson like a familiar blanket, and somewhere in the darkness, the mountains kept their ancient secrets while American soldiers slept safely behind concrete walls and razor wire. The following morning brought a different kind of attention to Kira's world, the kind that makes professional soldiers uncomfortable and career-minded officers start thinking about public relations implications. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the battalion commander, had scheduled a personal debrief that would determine how yesterday's engagement would be documented, recognized, and potentially publicized. Morrison was old-school Army, an infantry officer who had earned his spurs during the surge in Iraq and understood combat effectiveness in terms that transcended gender, politics, or social engineering experiments. When Kira entered his office and rendered the crisp salute that protocol demanded, he returned it with the kind of respect reserved for soldiers who had proven themselves under the most demanding circumstances possible. "Sergeant Volkov," he said, gesturing toward a chair positioned in front of his desk. "I've read Major Reynolds' initial report, and I have to say, yesterday's engagement represents some of the finest soldiering I've encountered in 24 years of service." The conversation that followed covered tactical details, lessons learned, and the kind of professional analysis that turns individual actions into institutional knowledge. But underlying the official discussion was a recognition of something more significant, the demonstration that combat effectiveness has nothing to do with preconceptions about gender roles and everything to do with training, competence, and the mental discipline required for precision shooting under pressure. I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star with Valor, Morrison said finally. And I'm also recommending you for assignment to the Special Operations community, if that's something you'd be interested in pursuing. The Bronze Star with Valor. It was the kind of recognition that defined military careers and represented official acknowledgement of exceptional performance under combat conditions. For Kira, it meant vindication of everything she'd worked to achieve, proof that capability trumps assumption when measured against the unforgiving standards of actual combat performance. But the offer of Special Operations assignment represented something even more significant: entry into the most elite levels of military service, where gender became irrelevant and only performance mattered. It was an opportunity to work with the finest soldiers in the world, to apply her skills at the highest levels of professional military service. "I'd be honored to be considered for Special Operations, sir," Kira replied. "It's what I've been working toward since my first deployment." News of the Bronze Star recommendation spread through the battalion with the same speed as yesterday's tactical gossip, but with a different quality of attention. This wasn't just a good war story anymore. It was official recognition of exceptional performance, the kind of award that validated individual achievement while reflecting positively on the entire unit. Hutchins found her at the rifle range that afternoon, where she was conducting routine maintenance on her equipment and working through the kind of precision shooting drills that kept her skills sharp. His approach was different again, not the dismissive confidence of 2 days ago or the grateful respect of yesterday, but something approaching professional admiration. "Heard about the Bronze Star," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "Well deserved, more than well deserved." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the afternoon light play across the mountain peaks that surrounded Fob Crimson. Between them lay an understanding that transcended their earlier interaction, the recognition that combat performance is the only metric that matters when people's lives depend on professional competence. "You know what the funny thing is," Hutchins said finally. "I've been shooting competitively since I was 12 years old, won state championships, set records that still stand, but I couldn't have made that shot yesterday. Hell, I don't know 3 guys in the entire Army who could have made that shot." It was an admission that cost him something, the acknowledgement that his assumptions about women and precision shooting had been not just wrong, but dramatically, embarrassingly wrong. But it was also recognition of something more profound, that exceptional performance transcends every preconception about who can and cannot excel in the most demanding aspects of military service. "My grandfather used to say that the rifle doesn't care who's holding it," Kira replied. "It only cares whether the person behind the trigger has done the work necessary to make the shot count." The conversation continued as the Afghan sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. 2 professional soldiers finding common ground in their shared appreciation for the skills that keep people alive in places where mistakes get measured in body bags. It was a conversation that would be repeated throughout Fob Crimson in the days that followed, as word of Kira's performance spread and assumptions about combat capability underwent the kind of revision that only comes through direct, undeniable evidence. But for Kira, the recognition mattered less than the knowledge that she had fulfilled the promise her grandfather had taught her to make with every trigger pull, the promise to those who depend on you that you will not fail when they need you most. The Bronze Star ceremony took place 3 weeks later in the battalion's makeshift auditorium, a concrete-walled room that doubled as a movie theater and briefing facility. The entire battalion was present, along with representatives from higher headquarters who had flown in specifically to witness the recognition of exceptional performance in combat. Kira stood at attention as Lieutenant Colonel Morrison read the citation, her dress uniform crisp despite the challenges of maintaining military appearance standards in a forward operating base. The formal language of the award citation transformed yesterday's engagement into the sanitized terminology of official recognition, but every soldier in the audience understood the reality behind the bureaucratic prose. For exceptionally valorous actions in combat operations against an armed enemy, Morrison read, his voice carrying clearly through the concrete room. Sergeant First Class Volkov demonstrated extraordinary courage and professional competence while providing precision sniper support for coalition forces under enemy fire. Her actions directly contributed to the successful extraction of friendly forces and the elimination of enemy threats that posed immediate danger to coalition personnel. The medal itself was a simple bronze star suspended from a red, white, and blue ribbon, nothing elaborate or ostentatious, just a small piece of metal that represented official acknowledgement of performance under the most demanding circumstances possible. But as Morrison pinned it to Kira's uniform, the weight of recognition settled onto her chest with significance that transcended the award's physical properties. After the ceremony, soldiers lined up to shake her hand and offer congratulations, their respect genuine and unqualified. These were combat veterans who understood the difference between administrative recognition and actual achievement, men and women who had seen enough action to recognize exceptional performance when it occurred. Hutchins was among the last to approach, his handshake firm and his expression carrying the kind of professional respect that develops between soldiers who have shared dangerous moments and emerged with mutual understanding. "Congratulations, Sergeant," he said, "and thank you for everything." "Thank you, Sergeant Hutchins, for giving me the opportunity to do my job." It was a simple exchange, but it represented something profound about professional recognition and personal growth. 2 weeks earlier, Hutchins had questioned whether women possessed the patience and precision necessary for effective sniper operations. Now he stood before a woman whose performance under combat conditions had exceeded anything he could have achieved himself. The special operations assignment came through official channels 2 months later, transferring Kira to a unit whose name and mission remained classified but whose reputation for excellence was legendary throughout the military community. It represented validation of her professional capabilities and entry into the most elite levels of military service. Her departure from FOB Crimson was marked by the kind of low-key farewell that characterized military transitions: handshakes, brief conversations, and the exchange of contact information that would maintain connections forged under shared hardship. But beneath the routine nature of military rotation lay recognition of something more significant. Kira Volkov had proven that combat effectiveness transcends every assumption about gender, capability, and the artificial limitations that society sometimes tries to impose on individual achievement. She had demonstrated that precision shooting is a skill that develops through training and practice, not an inherent characteristic determined by gender or physical attributes. Most importantly, she had shown that professional competence, when tested under the most demanding circumstances possible, becomes the only metric that matters for determining who succeeds and who fails in the unforgiving environment of military combat. As her helicopter lifted off from FOB Crimson for the last time, Kira looked down at the base where she had proven herself under conditions that left no room for doubt or qualification. Below, the mountains kept their ancient secrets, and somewhere in the valley, markers indicated where precision shooting had prevented tragedy and validated capabilities that some had questioned, but none could now deny. The story of Ghost and her 1,500-yard shot would become part of military folklore, repeated in sniper schools and special operations training facilities, where the next generation of precision shooters would learn that capability knows no boundaries, except those imposed by training, dedication, and the willingness to make every shot count when people's lives depend on professional excellence. But for the soldiers who had witnessed her performance firsthand, The story represented something simpler and more profound: proof that assumptions about capability are meaningless when measured against the unforgiving standards of actual performance under fire. In a world where mistakes get measured in body bags, only one question matters: can you make the shot when it counts? Kira Volkov had answered that question with a resounding yes, and in doing so, had redefined what was possible for everyone who would follow in her footsteps. 6 months after leaving Fob Crimson, Kira found herself in a different kind of classroom, a sterile conference room at the Special Operations Command, where her experience had been transformed into training material for the next generation of precision shooters. The PowerPoint presentation displayed on the wall screen reduced yesterday's life-and-death engagement to bullet points and tactical graphics, but the message remained clear. Exceptional performance under combat conditions validates capability regardless of preconceptions. The audience consisted of 32 special operations soldiers, including 12 women who were among the first to be fully integrated into previously male-only combat units. They listened with the focused attention that characterizes military personnel who understand that the lessons being presented might someday determine whether they live or die in similar circumstances. The key to long-range precision shooting, Kira explained, clicking to the next slide, isn't physical strength or gender-specific capabilities. It's the mental discipline required to maintain focus under pressure and the technical knowledge necessary to account for environmental factors that affect bullet trajectory. She described the mathematical calculations that governed extreme-range shooting, the formulas that compensated for air density, wind speed, and the Coriolis effect that becomes significant at distances beyond 1,000 yards. These weren't gender-specific skills. They were learned competencies that any soldier could master through proper training and dedicated practice. The enemy sniper I engaged at 1,847 yards was eliminated by superior training and better equipment, she continued. Not by inherent physical advantages or gender-related capabilities. He lost because he made tactical mistakes and I didn't. The Q&A session that followed covered technical aspects of precision shooting, equipment selection, and the psychological preparation necessary for long-range engagements. But underlying the professional discussion was recognition of something more significant: validation of capabilities that had been questioned and proof that combat effectiveness transcends every artificial limitation that society tries to impose. After the presentation, several of the female soldiers approached with questions that went beyond technical details. They wanted to know about career progression, about the challenges of proving yourself in male-dominated specialties, and about maintaining professional confidence in environments where capability was sometimes questioned based on assumptions rather than performance. "The only advice I can give," Kira told them, "is to be so good at your job that arguments about whether you belong become irrelevant. Master your craft to the point where performance speaks louder than prejudice." It was advice she had learned from her grandfather and validated through her own experience. The understanding that exceptional performance eventually silences every critic and validates every capability that others might question. In the military, where lives depend on professional competence, there is no substitute for demonstrated ability under the most demanding circumstances possible. The briefing concluded with a video testimonial from Master Sergeant Dale Hutchins, who had requested the opportunity to provide his perspective on the engagement that had saved his team. His words carried the weight of 23 years of military experience and the credibility that comes from having been saved by the very capabilities he had once questioned. "I was wrong," he said simply, his image filling the conference room's projection screen. "Wrong about women in combat roles, wrong about precision shooting capabilities, and wrong about making assumptions based on preconceptions rather than demonstrated performance. Sergeant Volkov didn't just save my life. She saved the lives of 11 other soldiers through skills that I couldn't have matched on my best day. The testimonial continued with technical analysis of the engagement, professional assessment of Kira's performance, and recommendations for training programs that would develop similar capabilities in other soldiers regardless of gender. But its most powerful element was Hutchins' admission that his assumptions had been not just incorrect, but dangerously wrong. In combat, he concluded, the only thing that matters is whether the person next to you can do their job when lives are on the line. Sergeant Volkov proved that capability has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with training, dedication, and professional competence. I'm honored to have served with her, and I'm grateful that she was there when my team needed her most. As the lights came up in the conference room, Kira looked at the faces of the soldiers who would carry forward the lessons of her engagement. Some would become instructors themselves, passing on the technical knowledge and professional attitudes that made exceptional performance possible. Others would apply these lessons in combat zones around the world, where the stakes would be measured in lives rather than training scores. But all of them would carry forward the understanding that capability transcends assumption, that professional competence is the only metric that matters when people's lives depend on individual performance, and that the question of who can excel in the most demanding aspects of military service has been answered definitively by soldiers like Ghost, whose precision under pressure proved that excellence knows no boundaries except those imposed by training and dedication. The legacy of that 1,500-yard shot would continue to resonate through military training programs and special operations units, a reminder that assumptions about capability are meaningless when measured against the unforgiving standards of actual performance under fire. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, markers would forever indicate the spot where prejudice met precision and lost decisively to the kind of professional excellence that defines the finest traditions of military service. Years later, when military historians examined the evolution of women in combat roles, they would identify specific moments when assumptions gave way to demonstrated capability. The engagement in the Korangal Valley would be recognized as one of those pivotal events, not because it was the first time a woman had performed exceptionally in combat, but because it provided undeniable proof that performance under the most demanding circumstances possible validates capability regardless of preconceptions. Kira Volkov had become more than just an exceptional soldier. She had become a symbol of what was possible when talent met opportunity and training, encountered the ultimate test of combat effectiveness. Her story would inspire the next generation of warriors while serving as a reminder that in the end, the only question that matters is simple. When lives are on the line, can you make the shot? The answer, delivered with devastating precision at 1,847 yards, was a resounding yes.